Good evening, my friend, and welcome to Bedtime Biographies. If you are settling in for the night, you are welcome to leave a comment below, letting us know where in the world you are listening from, or which historical life you would like us to spend an evening with next. And if these stories help you rest, subscribing is much appreciated. It helps me more than you can imagine. Now let the lights dim and let the world outside grow distant. Her face has looked out from paintings for more than 400 years. Pale skin, red hair, pearls sewn into fabric like frost on a window. A monarch so carefully painted, so deliberately presented, that the woman underneath the portrait has become strangely hard to find. We think we know her. We have seen the image so many times that we have stopped asking who stood behind it. She was a queen who never married, in an age when a woman's whole worth was measured by marriage. She ruled for 45 years in a country that did not entirely believe a woman could rule at all, and she came to power only after surviving a childhood that by any reasonable expectation should have destroyed her long before she ever wore a crown. This is the story of Elizabeth Tudor, not simply the queen who gave her name to an age, but the girl who spent years being told she did not matter, and the woman who spent the rest of her life making sure no one could say that again. There is something particular about Elizabeth's story that stays with me. So much of her power, later in life, was built on control. Control of her image, her words, her decisions, even control of whether she would ever say yes to a proposal of marriage. And yet, that instinct for control seems to trace back to a childhood in which she had almost none. She learned to master her circumstances only after watching her circumstances master everyone around her, including her own mother. Elizabeth was born on the 7th of September, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, on the bank of the River Thames east of London. It was early autumn, the kind of soft, uncertain weather where summer has not quite let go. Inside the palace, the birth had been awaited with enormous anticipation and enormous risk. Her father was Henry VIII, King of England, a man who had already broken from the Catholic Church, defied the Pope, and reshaped the religious life of his entire country for one overriding purpose. He needed a son. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him only a daughter who survived Mary. Desperate for a male heir, and infatuated with a woman at court named Anne Boleyn, Henry had set aside centuries of religious and political tradition to marry Anne instead. England's break with Rome, the creation of the Church of England, the entire course of the country's religious future, had been shaped in significant part by Henry's determination to have a son with this new wife. And then Anne gave him a daughter. The court astrologers, by most accounts, had predicted a boy. The birth announcements had already been prepared with the word prince written into them. According to tradition, the letter S had to be added by hand to change it to princess. It is a small detail, almost administrative, and yet it says something quite large. From the very first hours of her life, Elizabeth existed inside her father's disappointment. This did not mean she was unloved. Henry did attend her christening, held with real ceremony at the Church of the Observant Friars in Greenwich. She was given rich godparents, a title, a household. But the pressure that had produced her birth did not disappear simply because a daughter had arrived instead of a son. It shifted its shape, and it kept pressing. For the first 2.5 years of her life, Elizabeth lived the guarded, ceremonial existence of a royal child, her own household established at Hatfield, about 20 miles north of London, with nurses, rockers for her cradle, and servants whose entire purpose was her care. She would have known candlelight and thick tapestries against cold stone, the sound of many footsteps in long galleries, the particular hush that surrounds a child whose safety matters to the state. But her mother's position at court was never as secure as the ceremony around Elizabeth's birth might suggest. As Anne Boleyn had risen through Henry's passion and his hope for a son. When that son did not arrive, when a subsequent pregnancy ended in miscarriage, the foundation beneath Anne began to crack. Henry's attention had already turned toward another woman at court, Jane Seymour. And in the spring of 1536, when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, her mother was arrested. The charges brought against Anne Boleyn included adultery and treason. Historians today largely agree that the accusations were almost certainly fabricated, engineered to remove a wife the king no longer wanted, in a political and religious climate where the king's word was, for all practical purposes, law. Anne was tried, convicted, and on the 19th of May, 1536, executed by sword at the Tower of London. There is no reliable evidence that Elizabeth, not yet 3, understood what had happened to her mother. But the consequences reached her almost immediately, in ways a small child could feel, even without understanding them. Within weeks of the execution, Parliament declared the marriage between Henry and Anne invalid, meaning it had never legally existed at all. If the marriage had never existed, then the child of that marriage could not be considered legitimate. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was stripped of her title of princess. She became, officially, Lady Elizabeth, half-sister to the king's other daughter, Mary, who had endured the exact same demotion years earlier, when Henry annulled his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in order to marry Anne in the first place. Think about what this meant in practical terms, not simply symbolic ones. Household accounts from this period show real strain. There are surviving letters from those responsible for Elizabeth's care, complaining that she had outgrown her clothes, that funds for her household were not arriving as they should. One of her governesses, Lady Margaret Bryan, wrote directly to the King's Chief Minister, Thomas Cromwell, describing the child's needs and the household's uncertainty about its own standing. A little girl, suddenly without a mother, suddenly without her title, was in some very real sense being quietly forgotten by the court that had celebrated her birth less than 3 years before. And yet, Elizabeth was not abandoned. Her father, whatever his complicated feelings about the circumstances of her birth and the disgrace of her mother, did not erase her from his life. She was brought to court on occasion. She continued to receive an education appropriate to a king's daughter, even after her official status had been reduced. Something in her situation seems to have prompted particular attentiveness from those around her, almost as if the adults responsible for her sensed that this child, whatever her legal status, was not someone to be entirely dismissed. Henry's marital history did not end with Anne Boleyn's death. He married Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's execution, and Jane finally gave him the son he had wanted for so long, Edward, born in October of 1537. Jane died less than 2 weeks after the birth, from complications that were tragically common for the period. Henry would go on to marry 3 more times. Anne of Cleves, whom he divorced, Catherine Howard, whom he executed, on charges again involving adultery, and finally, Catherine Parr, who outlived him. It was Catherine Parr, the last of Henry's wives, who would have one of the most meaningful influences on the young Elizabeth's life, though that influence was still some years away. In the meantime, Elizabeth grew up in a household that, whatever its uncertainties, kept circling back to one theme. Royal children, however briefly out of favour, were still royal children. Blood mattered. Even a daughter whose mother had been executed for treason, whose own legitimacy had been legally erased, remained a member of the Tudor line, third in succession after her brother Edward and her half-sister Mary. Once Henry restored both his daughters to the line of succession in 1544, even while their legal status as legitimate children remained unresolved. This contradiction, being both officially diminished and undeniably royal, shaped the entire architecture of Elizabeth's early years. She lived inside a strange kind of double reality, alternately elevated and dismissed, depending on the political mood of a court that answered entirely to her father's changing will. What steadied her, more than anything else in these early years, was learning. Elizabeth showed early and unmistakable intellectual ability. She began her education at an early age with tutors chosen for the royal children, and by the time she reached her teens, she was working under one of the most respected scholars in England, a Cambridge academic named Roger Ascham. Ascham later wrote about his pupil with evident admiration, describing her mind as sharp, her memory as excellent, and her appetite for serious study as genuinely unusual for anyone of her age, let alone a young woman in the 1540s. She learned Latin and Greek. She studied history, rhetoric, theology, and the classical texts that formed the foundation of a humanist education in this period. She also became fluent in French and Italian and had a working knowledge of Spanish. Ascham designed for her a method of study called double translation, in which a passage would be translated from Latin or Greek into English, and then, sometime later, translated back into the original language without looking at the source text, so that the student could compare her own version against the original and study exactly where her understanding had gone wrong. It is a demanding, exacting exercise, requiring real discipline, and Elizabeth appears to have taken to it with genuine seriousness. Elizabeth was not simply well educated in the way many privileged children of the era might have been given lessons as a matter of course. Contemporary accounts describe a student who worked with real intensity, who appeared to find something like relief or even control in the discipline of study at a time when so much else in her life lay outside her control. Picture a cold stone schoolroom, a stack of Latin texts, ink drying slowly on a page by candlelight. These were among the few environments in which Elizabeth, as a girl of 10 or 11 or 12, could exercise complete mastery. No one could take away what she had learned. No one could annul it, or strip her of its title, or execute it for treason. It was also during these years that her father's final marriage brought a new and important figure into her life. Catherine Parr, who married Henry in 1543, took a personal interest in the education and welfare of all three of the king's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and young Edward. Catherine was intelligent, religiously reform-minded, and by most accounts, genuinely affectionate toward her stepdaughter. Under her influence, and with Henry's evident approval, Elizabeth was brought more consistently into the sphere of the royal family, no longer quite so peripheral as she had sometimes been in earlier years. It was to Catherine Parr that the young Elizabeth, around the age of 11, gave one of the more touching artifacts to survive from this period, a translation Elizabeth herself had made from French into English of a religious poem, which she copied out by hand and bound with a cover she had embroidered herself, in blue and silver thread, as a New Year's gift. The needlework is careful. The handwriting is neat, practiced, clearly the work of a child eager to demonstrate both her skill and her devotion. It survives today in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, a small physical trace of a girl trying to prove her worth to a stepmother she had come to depend on, in a family where worth was never something you could simply assume. Her father, Henry VIII, died in January of 1547, when Elizabeth was 13 years old. His son, Edward, only 9, became King Edward VI, with a council of regents managing the affairs of government during his minority. For Elizabeth, the king's death meant, among other things, a change of household. She went to live with her stepmother, Catherine Parr, who within months of Henry's death married again, this time for love, to a nobleman named Thomas Seymour. It is here that Elizabeth's story takes its first sharply uncomfortable turn, the first genuine wound of her adolescence, separate from the more distant trauma of her mother's death, which she had been too young to fully register at the time it happened. Thomas Seymour was the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour, ambitious, charming, and by most surviving accounts, reckless. Living in the same household as his new wife and his young stepdaughter, he began behaving toward the 13-year-old Elizabeth in ways that, even judged against the different norms of the 16th century, alarmed the people around her. Accounts from servants in the household, recorded later during an official investigation, describe Seymour entering Elizabeth's bedchamber early in the morning, sometimes before she had risen, in his nightclothes, tickling her, and on occasion behaving with a physical familiarity that unsettled the household staff who witnessed it. For a time, Catherine Parr herself appears to have treated this as boisterous, if inappropriate, horseplay, and on at least one occasion joined in some of these encounters herself, a detail that modern readers often find difficult to reconcile with what we now understand about the vulnerability of the situation. But the behavior continued, and it escalated to the point where, according to testimony gathered later, Catherine found her husband and her stepdaughter in an embrace that she found deeply troubling. Shortly afterward, in the spring of 1548, Elizabeth was sent away from the household to live instead with a trusted family friend, Sir Anthony Denny, and his wife. The full nature of what happened in that household during those months remains, in the strict historical sense, uncertain. We do not have Elizabeth's private thoughts recorded from this period, and later testimony was gathered under very particular political pressure, which makes some of the specific details difficult to verify with full confidence. What is clear is that Elizabeth, a young teenager, was placed in a position of real vulnerability by an adult with power over her household, in a way that appears to have frightened the adults responsible for her welfare, enough that they physically separated her from him. Catherine Parr died the following year, in September of 1548, from complications following the birth of her only child, a daughter. Thomas Seymour, now widowed, appears to have continued pursuing the idea of marrying Elizabeth herself, a plan that, given her place in the line of succession, carried real political danger. Servants in Elizabeth's own household were later found to have discussed the possibility of such a marriage in ways that suggested it had been actively considered, not merely gossiped about. By January of 1549, Thomas Seymour's ambitions had collided badly with the political realities of Edward's minority government, which was controlled in large part by his own brother, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. Thomas Seymour was arrested on charges that included plotting to control the young king and, by extension, the government of England. Investigators turned their attention to Elizabeth's household as well, questioning her own servants closely about the nature of her relationship with Seymour, about whether any secret marriage plan had existed, and about what exactly had taken place in Catherine Parr's household during the months Elizabeth had lived there. Elizabeth was 15 years old, and she was, in effect, being investigated for potential treason. What survives from this period is remarkable, not for what it reveals about scandal, but for what it reveals about Elizabeth's own instincts under pressure. Her cofferer, Thomas Parry, and her governess, Cat Ashley, were both arrested and interrogated, and both, under pressure, gave testimony that implicated Elizabeth in discussions about a possible marriage to Seymour. Elizabeth herself was questioned repeatedly, in writing, by an investigator named Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, who reported back to the government with evident frustration that the young woman gave nothing away. She was, he wrote, remarkably composed, careful in her answers, and unwilling to confirm anything that might implicate her. At one point, rumors reached Elizabeth that she was being accused of being pregnant with Seymour's child, hidden away somewhere in the countryside. In response, Elizabeth wrote directly to the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, asking that she be allowed to come to court in person so that the public could see with their own eyes that the rumors were false. It is an extraordinarily self-possessed request for a 15-year-old under formal government suspicion. Even this early, she understood that public perception was not a side issue to survival. It was survival itself. Thomas Seymour was executed in March of 1549, convicted of treason. Elizabeth, informed of his death, is reported by one of her attendants to have responded with a single, carefully restrained comment about the day being one on which a man of much wit and very little judgment had died. Not grief, not shock. A cool, measured verdict, delivered with the kind of self-control that 13 and 14 and 15 had apparently already taught her was necessary for survival at the edges of the Tudor court. She emerged from the Seymour affair without formal charge, her reputation shaken but not destroyed, having learned, in the most exposed and frightening way possible, exactly how quickly a young woman's proximity to power could become a young woman's proximity to disaster. It would not be the last time in her life that this lesson repeated itself, and each time it did, Elizabeth's instinct for caution, for guarded language, for withholding her true feelings behind a composed public face, would grow a little more pronounced. She was not yet queen. She was not yet close to it. Her young half-brother, Edward, sat on the throne, guided by a council of powerful men, and ahead of Elizabeth in the line of succession stood her older half-sister, Mary, a devout Catholic in a country whose religious identity had been violently reshaped by their father and was about to be pulled in yet another direction entirely. But something had already begun. The particular mixture of intelligence, caution, composure, and quiet endurance that Elizabeth had been forced to develop simply in order to survive her own childhood was, without anyone fully realizing it yet, assembling itself into the temperament of a ruler. Edward VI was a serious, studious boy, raised in the Reformed Protestant faith that had taken firmer hold in England during his father's later years. He and Elizabeth shared tutors, shared a similar intellectual temperament, and by most accounts genuinely cared for one another, exchanging letters that show real warmth between a brother and sister who had both, in their own ways, grown up at the mercy of other people's decisions. But Edward's health was never strong, and in the early months of 1553, it began to fail seriously. He was 15 years old. The prospect of Edward's death set off an urgent and dangerous crisis of succession. By the terms of Henry VIII's will, and by the Act of Parliament that had restored his daughters to the line of succession, the throne would pass next to Mary, Elizabeth's older half-sister, and after Mary, to Elizabeth herself. But Mary was a devout Catholic, and Edward's government, along with much of the ruling class that had built its fortunes and its faith around the new Protestant church, viewed the prospect of a Catholic queen with real alarm. In the final weeks of his life, under pressure from his chief minister, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, Edward drew up a document attempting to alter the succession entirely, bypassing both of his half-sisters in favor of his cousin, a 16-year-old noblewoman named Jane Grey, who happened to be married, conveniently for Northumberland, to Northumberland's own son. Edward died on the 6th of July, 1553. Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen 4 days later. It did not last. Mary, informed of her brother's death and of the plot to deny her the throne, rallied support with remarkable speed, drawing on the deep well of loyalty that still existed for Henry VIII's eldest daughter, particularly outside London, in more conservative and Catholic parts of the country. Within days, the council that had backed Jane Grey collapsed, switching its allegiance to Mary almost as quickly as it had abandoned her. Jane Grey's reign lasted 9 days. Mary entered London in triumph at the end of July, and by early August she was recognised, without serious dispute, as Queen of England. For Elizabeth, not yet 20 years old, her sister's accession brought a complicated mixture of relief and danger. She had wisely kept her distance from the plot to install Jane Grey, refusing to be drawn into a scheme that would have required denying her own place in the succession her father had established. When Mary made her formal entrance into London, Elizabeth rode beside her, a visible show of loyalty and family unity that the two sisters, for a brief season, seemed genuinely willing to display. But the unity was fragile from the start, and it rested on a foundation that was bound to crack. Mary was Catholic, deeply and sincerely so, shaped by a childhood in which she had watched her own mother, Catherine of Aragon, cast aside, and had herself once been forced, under threat, to sign a document declaring her parents' marriage invalid and acknowledging her own illegitimacy, a humiliation she never fully forgave. Elizabeth had been raised, particularly under Catherine Parr's influence, in the Reformed Protestant tradition that had come to dominate English religious life during Edward's reign. The two sisters did not simply disagree about politics. They disagreed about the ultimate nature of truth, salvation, and the correct order of the universe, at a time when such disagreements were not treated as private matters of conscience, but as questions the state had a direct interest in settling, by force if necessary. Mary set about restoring Catholic worship across England, reversing the reforms of her father and brother's reigns. and she made clear, early and often, her hope that Elizabeth would convert, or at minimum attend Catholic Mass, as a public demonstration of loyalty. Elizabeth, for her part, walked an extraordinarily careful line. She did, on occasion, attend Mass, apparently under pressure, while at the same time privately signalling, through trusted intermediaries, that her true religious sympathies lay elsewhere. It was a performance of conformity without genuine conversion, the kind of careful, layered self-presentation that Elizabeth had already begun to master during the Seymour affair, and that she would refine over the following decades into one of the defining instruments of her survival. It was not enough to satisfy Mary, and it was almost certainly not enough to satisfy the Queen's advisors, several of whom viewed Elizabeth as the leading Protestant claimant to the throne, as a permanent and dangerous rallying point for anyone who opposed Mary's religious policies. That danger became explicit in January of 1554, when a nobleman named Sir Thomas Wyatt led an armed uprising in Kent, provoked in large part by public anger over Mary's announced plan to marry Philip of Spain, a marriage that many English subjects feared would drag the country into subordination to a foreign Catholic power. Wyatt's rebellion was defeated within weeks, its leader captured and eventually executed. But during his interrogation, and under significant pressure, Wyatt was reported to have implicated Elizabeth, suggesting she had known of or even encouraged the plot to remove Mary from the throne. Elizabeth always denied any involvement, and the evidence connecting her directly to the rebellion has never been considered strong by historians who have examined it since. But suspicion, in the political climate of Mary's early reign, did not require proof. It required only enough uncertainty to justify caution, and Mary's advisors were not inclined toward generosity where Elizabeth was concerned. In March of 1554, Elizabeth was arrested and brought to the Tower of London. She arrived by river on a grey, wet morning, entering through the Watergate, later known with a certain grim theatricality as Traitor's Gate, the same entrance her own mother had passed through 18 years earlier, on her way to trial and execution. There is no record of Elizabeth's exact private thoughts as she stepped from the boat onto the stone steps, and it would be a mistake to invent them. But it is difficult to imagine that the parallel escaped her entirely. She was 20 years old, imprisoned in the same fortress where her mother had been beheaded, facing accusations of treason brought by a sister who held complete power over whether she would live or die. She remained in the tower for nearly 2 months. Conditions for a prisoner of her rank were not those of a common cell. She had rooms, attendants, and some access to correspondence, though always under close guard and constant suspicion. But the psychological weight of the imprisonment was severe. She was questioned repeatedly about her connections to Wyatt and to other Protestant conspirators, and she maintained, with the same composed insistence she had shown during the Seymour investigation years before, that she had done nothing disloyal. Mary's council was divided over what to do with her. Some among the Queen's advisors, most notably Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester and one of Mary's most trusted counsellors, appear to have genuinely believed Elizabeth guilty, or at minimum considered her too dangerous to leave alive as a focus for future rebellion. Others were more cautious, wary of executing a princess of the royal blood without clear proof, particularly given how the country's already uncertain political mood might respond to it. Mary herself, according to surviving accounts, wavered between suspicion of her sister and a more complicated, unresolved family loyalty that never entirely disappeared, even at the moments of greatest tension between them. In May of 1554, without formal charge or trial, Elizabeth was released from the Tower and moved instead to a form of house arrest at Woodstock, a royal manor northwest of London that had fallen into some disrepair. Her custodian there was Sir Henry Bedingfield, a loyal and cautious Catholic gentleman tasked with keeping her secure and, more importantly, keeping her isolated from any correspondence or visitors who might draw her back into conspiracy. Elizabeth's confinement at Woodstock lasted nearly a year, an uncomfortable, watchful, uncertain season in which she had reason, at almost every moment, to wonder whether her sister's suspicion might yet harden into something fatal. It was during this period, according to a tradition recorded not long afterward, that Elizabeth is said to have scratched a short verse into a window pane with a diamond, reflecting on the uncertainty of her situation, a fate decided by others, while she herself could do little but wait. The precise wording of the verse has come down to us through later accounts, rather than a document Elizabeth herself is known to have preserved, and its exact authorship cannot be verified with full confidence. But whether or not those particular words were hers, the sentiment they capture fits everything else we know about this stretch of her life. A woman of considerable intelligence and considerable ambition, reduced to watching, waiting, and hoping that her composure would be enough to keep her alive. She was eventually allowed to return closer to court, and by the spring of 1555, some of the immediate danger had passed. Mary, meanwhile, had married Philip of Spain, and for a period believed herself to be pregnant, an event that would have secured a Catholic heir and effectively ended Elizabeth's own prospects of ever inheriting the throne. The pregnancy, announced with real hope and even public celebration, never resulted in a child. Historians now generally believe it was a false pregnancy, possibly connected to an underlying illness, though the exact medical explanation remains a matter of some uncertainty. Mary's profound disappointment and the visible toll it appears to have taken on her was not lost on the court or on Elizabeth, whose own position shifted gradually and without any single dramatic turning point, from immediate danger toward cautious tolerance. The years that followed were quieter, though never entirely free of tension. Elizabeth lived largely away from court, at Hatfield, the same house where she had spent much of her early childhood, managing her own household with a growing competence that impressed those who observed it. She read extensively, continued her studies, and maintained a wide, careful network of correspondence and personal loyalty among figures who would later prove essential to her own government, including William Cecil, a former civil servant under Edward, who had quietly weathered Mary's reign and would go on to become the most important advisor of Elizabeth's entire life. Mary's reign, meanwhile, grew increasingly difficult. Her marriage to Philip brought England into Spain's costly war with France, a conflict that ended in the loss of Calais, England's last remaining territory on the European mainland, a defeat Mary is said to have taken as a personal wound she would carry for the rest of her life. At home, her efforts to restore Catholicism were accompanied by the burning of several hundred Protestants convicted of heresy, a policy that earned her, in later Protestant memory, the enduring and largely simplified nickname of Bloody Mary. The reality of Mary's reign, like most reigns, resists such a simple label. She governed during a genuinely difficult period, facing war, failed harvests, and a country still uncertain of its own religious identity after decades of upheaval. But the human cost of the religious persecutions was severe and well documented, and it left a mark on the national memory that would shape how Elizabeth herself approached questions of religion once the throne eventually passed to her. By the autumn of 1558, Mary's health, never fully robust, began to fail seriously. She had no child, no acknowledged heir beyond her half-sister, and whatever personal reservations she still held about Elizabeth's religious sincerity, the practical reality of the succession left her little choice. In November, Mary formally acknowledged Elizabeth as her successor. Elizabeth was at Hatfield when the news came that Mary had died on the 17th of November, 1558. According to a tradition recorded not long after the event, she was sitting beneath an oak tree on the grounds when messengers arrived to tell her that she was now Queen of England. Whether the specific detail of the oak tree is precisely accurate cannot be confirmed with certainty, but the moment itself, the arrival of the news, the sudden and irreversible change in her circumstances after 25 years defined so often by danger, suspicion, and waiting, is not in question. She is reported to have responded, quoting a line of scripture in Latin, that this was the Lord's doing, and it was marvelous in her eyes. It is a fitting reaction for a woman who had spent so much of her life uncertain whether she would live to see this day at all. She was 25 years old. She had survived her mother's execution before she could properly remember it. She had survived her own father's ambivalence, her stepfather's dangerous attentions, a formal investigation for treason as a teenager, imprisonment in the tower where her mother had died, and years of watchful, uncertain confinement under a sister who never fully trusted her. She had learned, through all of it, an instinct for composure, patience, and careful self-presentation that few rulers before or since have possessed in quite the same measure. Now, at last, she had the throne. What she did not yet have, and what almost no one in England fully believed she could have, was the ability to actually hold it. England in 1558 was a country in genuine difficulty. The war with France had drained the treasury and cost the nation its last continental territory. The currency had been debased for years, weakening its value and unsettling trade. Religious division ran through every level of society, with Catholics and Protestants each having, within living memory, watched the other side executed for heresy or treason, depending on which monarch currently held power. England's international standing was weak, its military limited, its diplomatic position uncertain, caught between the much larger and more powerful kingdoms of France and Spain. And there was, hovering over all of it, the deep and largely unexamined assumption, shared by many of Elizabeth's own advisors, as much as by foreign observers, that a woman was simply not suited to rule a kingdom in a dangerous world. England had had a reigning queen before, briefly, in the 12th century. In a period of civil war so chaotic, it had entered popular memory as a cautionary tale rather than a precedent. More recently, Mary's own reign, difficult as it had been, had done little to reassure skeptics that female rule could bring stability rather than crisis. Elizabeth understood this skepticism with total clarity, because she had absorbed it, quite literally, since childhood. She had grown up inside a court built entirely around the urgent need for a male heir. a court in which her own birth had been recorded, almost apologetically, with a single added letter on a piece of parchment. She knew, perhaps better than anyone else in England, exactly how much she would need to prove, and how quickly, if she intended to survive as queen, rather than simply occupy the position as a temporary and uncertain placeholder. What she chose to do in the earliest days of her reign reveals something essential about how she intended to rule. She did not surround herself with untested favorites or dramatic new appointments designed to signal a sharp break from the past. Her very first major decision as queen was to appoint William Cecil as her principal secretary, the same careful, capable administrator she had cultivated a quiet friendship with during the uncertain years of Mary's reign. Cecil would go on to serve Elizabeth for nearly 40 years, becoming perhaps the single most consistent and trusted figure of her entire government. In appointing him on her very first day as queen, Elizabeth signaled something that would define her leadership for decades to come: a preference for steady, capable counsel over dramatic gesture, and a rare, genuine gift for recognizing which people around her could be trusted, and for how long. Her coronation took place on the 15th of January, 1559, in Westminster Abbey, following a procession through London the day before that had been carefully designed, with Elizabeth's close involvement, to present her to her new subjects as approachable, gracious, and genuinely engaged with the ordinary people lining the streets to see her. Contemporary accounts describe her stopping her procession to accept small gifts and petitions from spectators, exchanging words with citizens along the route, and appearing, by the standards of the time, unusually warm and accessible for a monarch. It was a performance, in the sense that every royal procession is a performance, carefully staged and considered. But it was also, in its way, an act of genuine political intelligence. Elizabeth understood, from the very first days of her reign, that the loyalty of ordinary people, freely given rather than simply commanded, would matter enormously to the security of a queen whose legitimacy so many still quietly doubted. She had survived her childhood. She had survived her sister's suspicion. Now, at 25, wearing a crown that had come to her only after a lifetime of uncertainty about whether she would ever be allowed to hold real power at all, Elizabeth faced a different kind of test entirely, not simply staying alive, but proving, day after day, year after year, that a woman could govern a kingdom as well as any king who had come before her. The question that would follow her for the rest of her reign, raised almost immediately by her own parliament, was already waiting for her, just beneath the surface of the coronation celebration. Who would she marry? And when would she give England the heir that her father had once wanted so badly? He had reshaped the entire religious life of the country, trying to secure one. Elizabeth's answer to that question, and the way she managed to delay giving a final one for the rest of her life, would become one of the defining strategies of her entire reign. Almost from the moment Elizabeth took the throne, the question of her marriage became a matter of state, discussed with an intensity that from the distance of centuries can be difficult to fully appreciate. This was not simply a private matter of the Queen's heart. In a hereditary monarchy, the marriage of a reigning queen determined the future of the entire kingdom. Who would share her power? What foreign alliances might follow? And most urgently of all, whether England would have an heir to prevent the very kind of succession crisis that had shadowed Elizabeth's own path to the throne. Parliament raised the matter within weeks of her coronation and would continue raising it with mounting anxiety for the next 3 decades. Suitors arrived from across Europe. Philip of Spain, her sister's widower, offered himself as a candidate early on, a proposal that carried obvious political logic but equally obvious religious complication, given Elizabeth's Protestant sympathies and the deep unpopularity among her subjects of the Spanish marriage that had brought Mary so much grief. Archduke Charles of Austria was proposed. The Duke of Anjou, and later his younger brother, the Duke of Alençon, both sons of the French royal family, would pursue Elizabeth's hand across many years. In a courtship that dragged on so long, it became something of a running feature of European diplomacy. Elizabeth entertained nearly all of them, at various points, with apparent seriousness. She corresponded, exchanged portraits, allowed ambassadors to believe negotiations were progressing. And then, again and again, she found reasons to delay, to raise new conditions, to let the negotiations quietly stall, rather than reach any binding conclusion. Historians have long debated exactly why. Some point to religious obstacles that made nearly every foreign match diplomatically awkward. Some suggest genuine caution, born from watching her father cycle through 6 wives and her sister suffer through an unpopular and childless foreign marriage. Others suggest that Elizabeth, having watched what marriage did to the women in her own family, being made and unmade, exalted and executed, according to a husband's convenience, had concluded that an unmarried queen retained a kind of independent authority that a married one could not. What is certain is that the ambiguity itself became a tool. As long as Elizabeth remained unmarried and uncommitted, foreign powers had reason to court English favour, rather than risk alienating a queen whose hand might yet be theirs. The moment she committed to one match, she would instantly transform every disappointed suitor's country into a potential rival, if not an outright enemy. Whether by careful calculation or by an instinct sharpened through years of watching the political value of uncertainty, Elizabeth turned the very question that was supposed to define and limit her into one of her most effective instruments of diplomacy. But there was one relationship, closer to home, that cut through the diplomatic calculation in a way none of the foreign proposals ever quite managed to. His name was Robert Dudley, and Elizabeth had known him since childhood. Some accounts suggest they were taught briefly by some of the same tutors as children, and their friendship, whatever its exact origins, was clearly of long standing by the time Elizabeth became queen. Dudley was handsome, athletic, charming, and from virtually the first days of her reign was granted an extraordinary degree of intimacy and favour. Elizabeth appointed him Master of the Horse, a position that placed him in close daily physical proximity to the Queen, overseeing her transport and, in practice, spending significant time at her side. Ambassadors reporting home to their own governments noted, with a mixture of fascination and alarm, how openly affectionate the Queen appeared toward Dudley, how much time she spent in his company, and how her manner toward him seemed to differ from her manner toward every other man at court. There was, however, an obstacle that made the entire situation deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Dudley was already married to a woman named Amy Robsart, whom he had wed years earlier, before Elizabeth's accession, in a match that appears to have had little to do with the political ambitions that would later define his life at court. As Elizabeth's evident favour toward Dudley grew, Amy remained largely out of view, living apart from her husband at various country houses. Her health, according to some reports, already in decline. In September of 1560, Amy Robsart was found dead at the foot of a staircase at Cumnor Place, the house where she had been staying in Oxfordshire. She had, according to household accounts, given her servants an unusual amount of freedom to attend a local fair that day, an arrangement that later fed speculation that she had wanted to be alone in the house. An inquest was convened, and it returned a verdict of accidental death, consistent with a fall. But the timing, and the obvious political stakes involved, meant that the verdict satisfied almost no one. Rumours spread immediately, and persistently, that Dudley had arranged his wife's death in order to clear the way for marriage to the Queen. There is no reliable evidence that Dudley was responsible for his wife's death, and modern historians examining the surviving records have generally leaned toward the conclusion that it was, in fact, an accident, though the possibility of suicide, connected perhaps to illness or depression, has also been raised as a serious alternative explanation. What is beyond dispute is the effect the scandal had on Elizabeth's own position. Whatever her private feelings for Dudley, and the evidence suggests those feelings were genuine and considerable, marrying him now, under a cloud of suspicion surrounding his wife's convenient death, would have been political suicide. Foreign courts speculated openly about the Queen's involvement or complicity. Her own counsel, led with quiet insistence by William Cecil, made clear that such a marriage would badly damage both her domestic authority and her international standing. Elizabeth never married Robert Dudley. She kept him close for the rest of his life, elevated him eventually to the title of Earl of Leicester, relied on him as a trusted advisor, and during moments of crisis, as a military commander. Their relationship, whatever its exact private nature, remained one of the most consistent and emotionally significant of her entire life, surviving his eventual marriage to another woman years later, an event that, by contemporary accounts, wounded Elizabeth considerably, even though she herself had never agreed to marry him. But the Amy Robsart affair marked, in many ways, the moment when the possibility of Elizabeth marrying for love, rather than policy, effectively closed. From this point forward, her unmarried state, whatever emotional cost it carried, became something closer to a settled feature of her reign, rather than a temporary condition awaiting resolution. Think about what this meant for Elizabeth as a person, separate from what it meant for the kingdom she governed. She had grown up watching marriage destroy the women closest to her. Her own mother, executed in part because a marriage had failed to produce a son. Catherine Howard, her father's fifth wife, executed for infidelity when Elizabeth was a small child. Catherine Parr, the stepmother she loved, who died from the complications of childbirth after her final marriage. Her sister Mary, humiliated by a foreign match that brought her little but disappointment and grief. Whatever calculating political logic lay behind Elizabeth's famous refusal to marry, and there was certainly calculating political logic involved, it is difficult not to notice how closely her choice tracked with the lessons her own life had already taught her about what marriage, for a Tudor woman, tended to cost. She cultivated, over the following decades, a public identity that transformed her unmarried status from a liability into something closer to a national mythology. She began to present herself, in speeches to Parliament and in the elaborate visual language of court portraiture, as a queen married instead to her kingdom, a monarch whose entire devotion belonged to England itself rather than to any single husband. In one famous address to Parliament, delivered when pressure over the succession question had grown especially intense, she is recorded as telling her assembled lords that it would be sufficient, when she was dead, that a marble stone should declare that a queen, having reigned a certain time, lived and died a virgin. The phrase, and the broader image it belonged to, the Virgin Queen, would become one of the most enduring symbols of her entire reign, deliberately cultivated, carefully maintained, and by the later decades of her rule, presented with an almost religious intensity in the portraits and pageantry surrounding her. But behind the myth lay the ordinary, complicated reality of a woman who had, by most accounts, genuinely loved at least one man she could never safely marry, and who spent the rest of her life managing both the political consequences and the personal cost of that unresolved choice. While the marriage question occupied so much public attention, Elizabeth was also confronting the deeper structural problem that had troubled England for a generation: religion. She inherited a country that had been pulled, within the space of little more than 20 years, from Catholicism to a reformed Protestant church under Edward, and then back to Catholicism under Mary, with real human suffering attached to each turn. Elizabeth's own religious instincts appear to have leaned toward a moderate, reformed Protestantism, shaped significantly by Catherine Parr's early influence. But she was, throughout her reign, notably reluctant to pursue the kind of aggressive doctrinal enforcement that had characterized both her brother's and her sister's governments. What emerged in the religious settlement of 1559 was a deliberately moderate arrangement, sometimes described by historians as the Elizabethan settlement, which established Elizabeth as supreme governor of the Church of England, rather than the more theologically loaded title of supreme head that her father had claimed, a small but meaningful adjustment intended to ease Catholic objections to a female ruler occupying a position traditionally understood in explicitly headship terms. The settlement retained much of the ceremonial and structural framework of the Church, while establishing a Protestant doctrinal foundation, in an arrangement designed above all to be broad enough that the majority of English subjects, whatever their private religious convictions, could conform to it in practice without being forced into open rebellion of conscience. It was not a perfect solution, and it did not eliminate religious tension from Elizabeth's reign. Catholics who refused to attend the required Protestant services, known as recusants, faced escalating fines and legal pressure as the reign progressed, particularly after later political crises hardened Elizabeth's government's suspicion of Catholic loyalty. And more radical Protestants, who believed the settlement had not gone nearly far enough in reforming the Church's ceremony and structure, would spend the following decades pressing for further change, eventually giving rise to the Puritan movement that would so significantly shape England's religious and political future long after Elizabeth's death. But compared to the violent doctrinal enforcement of her brothers' and sisters' reigns, Elizabeth's settlement represented a genuine, deliberate effort to reduce the human cost of religious division, an effort rooted, in all likelihood, in her own uncomfortably close memory of what it felt like to live under a ruler determined to force conformity by threat of fire. The early 1560s brought Elizabeth a different kind of challenge, arriving not from within her own kingdom, but from just across her northern border. In 1561, a young widow returned from France to claim her inheritance as Queen of Scots. Her name was Mary Stuart, commonly known to history as Mary, Queen of Scots, and she was, by blood, Elizabeth's cousin. and by Catholic reckoning, in some interpretations, a claimant to the English throne herself, descended through her grandmother from Henry VII, Elizabeth's own grandfather. Mary's return to Scotland set in motion one of the longest and most consequential relationships of Elizabeth's entire reign, a relationship the two women would conduct almost entirely through letters and intermediaries, since the cousins would, in the end, never actually meet face to face in person, despite years of proposed and ultimately abandoned plans for a personal meeting between them. At the outset, the danger Mary posed to Elizabeth was more potential than immediate. Scotland, a separate and often turbulent kingdom, had its own internal religious and political conflicts to manage. And Mary, young, recently widowed, and unfamiliar with the particular dynamics of Scottish politics after years spent at the French court, faced immediate challenges simply holding on to power in her own country. But the underlying fact remained, and would remain for the rest of both women's lives. In the eyes of English Catholics who did not recognize the legitimacy of Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth herself was not the rightful queen at all. Mary, by that same reckoning, was the true and legitimate heir to the English throne, a fact that made her, whether she actively sought the role or not, the natural focus of every plot, rebellion, and foreign intrigue aimed at removing Elizabeth from power. For nearly 3 decades, this shadow would fall across Elizabeth's reign with varying intensity, receding at times into quiet diplomatic correspondence between the two queens, and flaring, at others, into genuine crises that threatened Elizabeth's throne. And eventually, though only after years of extraordinary reluctance on Elizabeth's part, Mary's very life. But that reckoning still lay decades in the future. In these early years of Elizabeth's reign, the relationship between the two cousin queens remained largely one of careful diplomatic maneuvering, each aware of the other's claim, each managing, for the time being, a fragile and watchful peace. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was learning the practical business of governing in earnest. She attended council meetings with real engagement, read diplomatic correspondence closely, and developed, under the steady guidance of her secretary Cecil, a genuine command of the details of statecraft that surprised many who had assumed, on the basis of her sex alone, that she would defer entirely to her male advisors. She was, by contemporary accounts, notably frugal with royal finances, a habit shaped no doubt by the memory of a treasury drained by her sister's war and her father's extravagance. And she showed, from early in her reign, a marked preference for caution over bold or costly action, a temperament that some of her more aggressive advisors, eager for direct military confrontation with Catholic powers abroad, found frustrating, but which would, over the following decades, prove remarkably well suited to keeping England solvent, stable, and largely out of the ruinous continental wars that consumed so much of France and Spain's resources during the same period. She was not, in these years, universally beloved, nor was her hold on the throne ever entirely secure. But she had survived her childhood, survived her sister's suspicion, navigated the dangerous early questions of marriage and succession without committing herself to any single, potentially catastrophic course, and established, in Cecil and in the broader machinery of her early government, a foundation of steady, capable rule that would serve her well as the challenges of the following decades grew considerably more severe. Ahead of her lay decades that would test everything she had learned, from the cold schoolroom at Hatfield to the water gate of the Tower. plots against her life. A war with the most powerful navy in the known world. A decision regarding her own cousin's fate that she would spend the rest of her life trying not to fully confront. And eventually, the slow arrival of old age in a court that had spent 40 years building its entire identity around the image of an eternally youthful queen. But for now, in the early 1560s, Elizabeth ruled a kingdom that had, against most expectations, begun to steady itself under her hand. The girl who had once been reduced to Lady Elizabeth, stripped of her title before she could properly speak, was, at last, unmistakably a queen. By the late 1560s, the fragile peace between Elizabeth and her cousin in Scotland had begun to unravel, and it did so through a sequence of events that had far more to do with Mary's own turbulent personal life than with any deliberate plot against England. Mary's second marriage to her cousin, Lord Darnley, had collapsed into violence and suspicion, culminating in Darnley's murder in 1567 under circumstances that implicated, in the eyes of many of her own nobles, Mary herself, or at minimum the man she married shortly afterward, the Earl of Bothwell, who was widely believed to have orchestrated the killing. The scandal proved fatal to Mary's authority in Scotland. Facing open rebellion from her own nobility, she was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, James, and imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle. In the spring of 1568, she managed to escape, raised a small army, was defeated, and fled south across the border into England, arriving not as a conquering rival, but as a desperate refugee, seeking her cousin's protection. This placed Elizabeth in an extraordinarily difficult position, one that would define the remainder of her reign in ways she could not yet fully anticipate. Mary was a fellow queen, and the principle of royal solidarity, the idea that monarchs did not simply hand one another over to their enemies or subject one another to trial by lesser subjects, mattered enormously to Elizabeth, who understood better than almost anyone alive just how easily a monarch's authority could be questioned or overturned. And yet Mary was also, by the reckoning of English Catholics who did not recognize Elizabeth's own legitimacy, the true Queen of England, a fact that made her presence on English soil, whatever her personal circumstances, an immediate and serious political danger. Elizabeth's solution, reached only after considerable deliberation, was to neither fully welcome Mary as a guest, nor return her to the enemies who would very likely have executed her in Scotland. Instead, Mary was placed under a form of extended house arrest, moved between a series of English castles and manor houses, most notably Tutbury and Sheffield Castle, under the custody of the Earl of Shrewsbury and his formidable wife, Bess of Hardwicke. What had been intended, at least at first, as a temporary arrangement stretched into years, and then into decades. Mary would remain a prisoner in England, in one location or another, for the next 19 years. Her presence, however carefully guarded, transformed the political landscape of Elizabeth's reign. For English Catholics who hoped to see the old religion restored, and for the foreign Catholic powers of Spain and at times France, who viewed Elizabeth's Protestant England as a rival to be weakened or overthrown, Mary represented something enormously valuable, a legitimate alternative monarch already resident on English soil, around whom a rebellion or invasion could be organized. Over the following 2 decades, a series of conspiracies emerged, each proposing, in one form or another, to remove Elizabeth from the throne and install Mary in her place, often with the backing or at least the tacit encouragement of Spain. The first serious plot, uncovered in 1571 and known to history as the Ridolfi plot, after the Italian banker who helped coordinate it, envisioned a Spanish-backed invasion of England, the assassination or overthrow of Elizabeth, and Mary's marriage to an English Catholic nobleman, the Duke of Norfolk, who would then rule jointly with her. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out, largely through the intelligence-gathering efforts of Elizabeth's government, which had, by this point, begun developing a genuinely sophisticated network of spies and informants under the direction of a man who would become one of the most important figures of the entire reign, Francis Walsingham. Norfolk was executed for his role in the conspiracy. Mary, whose direct involvement was less clearly proven but widely suspected, was not, at this stage, held to full account for the plot bearing her name. Elizabeth, despite considerable pressure from Parliament and from advisers who argued that Mary represented an intolerable ongoing threat, resisted calls to have her cousin formally tried or executed. It was a pattern that would repeat itself, with mounting frustration among her own councillors for the next 16 years. Plot after plot uncovered, each one implicating Mary to varying degrees, and each time Elizabeth choosing restraint over the harsher justice her advisers believed the situation demanded. Why Elizabeth showed such persistent reluctance to move decisively against Mary remains one of the more genuinely debated questions of her reign. Part of the answer surely lies in that same instinct toward royal solidarity, the deep unease at the precedent of one anointed queen authorizing the execution of another, a precedent that could, in theory, be turned against Elizabeth herself by some future parliament or rebellious faction. Part of it may reflect a genuine, if complicated, family feeling for a cousin whose life had been, in its own way, nearly as turbulent and precarious as Elizabeth's own. And part of it likely reflects Elizabeth's characteristic caution, her lifelong preference, visible since the days of the Seymour investigation, for delay and ambiguity over any final, irreversible action. But the plots did not stop, and each one narrowed Elizabeth's options a little further. In 1583, another conspiracy, known as the Throckmorton Plot, was uncovered, again involving a proposed Spanish and French Catholic invasion, timed to coincide with an internal Catholic uprising in support of Mary. Walsingham's intelligence network, which by now included agents placed within Mary's own household and correspondence intercepted through elaborately coded channels that Walsingham's codebreakers had learned to crack, uncovered the plot before it could be executed. Francis Throckmorton, the English Catholic gentleman at its centre, was tried and executed. The final and most consequential of these conspiracies emerged in 1586, and it is known to history as the Babington Plot, named for Anthony Babington, a young English Catholic gentleman drawn into a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne with foreign military support. What made the Babington Plot different from its predecessors was the quality of the evidence Walsingham's network was able to gather. Mary's correspondence, smuggled in and out of her confinement in specially sealed casks of beer, had been intercepted for months by Walsingham's agents, decoded, copied, and in at least one crucial instance, forged with an additional postscript designed to draw out further incriminating detail before being resealed and delivered as though nothing had been touched. Through this correspondence, Walsingham obtained what he had spent years working to acquire: a letter in which Mary appeared to give explicit written approval to the plan to assassinate Elizabeth. Babington and his fellow conspirators were arrested, tried, and executed with considerable brutality in a public spectacle so severe that Elizabeth herself, informed of the details afterward, is reported to have expressed some private discomfort at its excessive cruelty and ordered that later executions connected to the plot be carried out with somewhat less severity. For Mary, the evidence gathered from the intercepted letters left Elizabeth's government with what it had long sought: grounds to bring her cousin to formal trial. Mary was moved to Fotheringhay Castle and tried in October of 1586 before a commission of English noblemen under a law passed some years earlier, specifically to allow the trial of any person found to be complicit in a plot against the Queen's life, even one who might otherwise claim immunity as a foreign sovereign. Mary conducted her own defense with considerable skill and dignity, questioning the reliability of copied and potentially altered correspondence, and pointing out, with some justice, that she had never been permitted to see the original documents used against her, nor granted legal counsel, nor tried by anything resembling a jury of her recognized peers. The commission nonetheless found her guilty of complicity in the plot and recommended the sentence that the law allowed: death. What followed was one of the longest and most visibly agonized decisions of Elizabeth's entire reign. Parliament, upon receiving the verdict, petitioned urgently for the sentence to be carried out, viewing Mary's continued survival as an unacceptable and ongoing danger to the Queen's life and the security of the realm. Elizabeth, for her part, delayed for months, evidently torn between the practical argument for Mary's execution and a deep personal reluctance to authorize the killing of an anointed queen and a cousin, however dangerous her presence had become. Surviving letters and the accounts of those close to Elizabeth during this period describe a woman under visible strain, alternating between decisiveness and hesitation in a manner unlike almost any other episode of her reign. She eventually signed the death warrant in February of 1587, but appears to have intended, or at least hoped, that its execution might be delayed further, or perhaps quietly avoided altogether through some other means. Her secretary, William Davison, was given the signed warrant, and members of her council, without waiting for Elizabeth's final explicit instruction to proceed, moved quickly to have it carried out, apparently concerned that further delay might allow the Queen to reverse her decision entirely. Mary was executed on the 8th of February, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle, going to her death, by contemporary accounts, with considerable composure and evident preparation. Dressed in a red petticoat beneath her black outer garments, red being, in Catholic tradition, a colour associated with martyrdom. When Elizabeth learned that the execution had already been carried out, without what she seems to have regarded as her final, considered consent, her reaction was reportedly one of genuine and prolonged distress and anger, directed particularly at Davison, who was arrested and imprisoned, and at the councillors who had, in her view, acted with unauthorized haste. Whether this reaction reflected authentic grief and horror at what had been done in her name, or a more calculated effort to distance herself publicly from a decision she knew would damage her standing among fellow European monarchs, has been debated by historians ever since, and the honest answer is probably some combination of both. Elizabeth had, after all, signed the warrant herself. But the depth and duration of her distress, described consistently by multiple witnesses at court in the days that followed, suggests something more than pure political theatre. a genuine anguish at having been, in the end, responsible for the death of a fellow queen, whatever the justification. Look closely at what this moment reveals, set against the whole arc of Elizabeth's life so far. This was a woman who had spent her childhood watching those around her, including her own mother, destroyed by the absolute power of a monarch acting on suspicion and political necessity. She had been imprisoned herself, questioned as a potential traitor, brought within uncomfortable proximity of execution more than once before she ever wore a crown. And now, at 53 years old, she had become the monarch who ordered another woman's death, under remarkably similar justification to the very forces that had once threatened her own life. Whatever combination of political calculation and genuine sorrow shaped her behavior in the weeks that followed, it is difficult not to see, in Elizabeth's evident anguish over Mary's execution, an echo of a childhood spent on the other side of exactly this kind of decision. Mary's death did not, in itself, resolve the deeper conflict that had shaped so much of Elizabeth's reign. If anything, it sharpened it. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe, had watched the years of plots against Elizabeth with growing interest, and had, on more than one occasion, quietly encouraged or financed conspiracies aimed at her overthrow. With Mary now dead, and with her no longer available as a Catholic alternative to install on the English throne, Philip's calculations shifted. Rather than supporting a plot to replace Elizabeth with her cousin, he began to consider a more direct solution entirely. The conquest of England itself by force, with Philip's own daughter, or another Catholic claimant installed as ruler in Elizabeth's place. The relationship between England and Spain had already been deteriorating for years before Mary's execution finally pushed it to the point of open war. English sailors and privateers, most famously Francis Drake, had spent much of the preceding 2 decades raiding Spanish shipping and Spanish colonial ports in the Americas, seizing vast quantities of silver and treasure bound for Philip's treasury, actions that Elizabeth herself quietly encouraged and profited from, even while maintaining, for diplomatic purposes, an official posture of peace with Spain. England had also provided support, cautious and often frustratingly limited by Elizabeth's own reluctance to commit fully to costly foreign war, to Protestant rebels fighting against Spanish rule in the Netherlands, a conflict Philip regarded as a direct English provocation against his own sovereign territory. By the time Mary's execution removed any remaining diplomatic pretense that England and Spain might avoid open conflict, Philip had already begun assembling what would become one of the largest naval expeditions Europe had ever seen, a vast fleet intended to carry an invading army from the Spanish Netherlands across the Channel and onto English soil. History would come to know it as the Spanish Armada, and its approach, in the summer of 1588, would bring Elizabeth's entire reign and the whole precarious project of Protestant, independent English rule that she had spent 30 years carefully building, to what many at the time genuinely believed might be its final and decisive test. The Spanish Armada that set sail from Lisbon in the late spring of 1588 was, by the standards of the age, an almost unimaginable undertaking. More than 130 ships, carrying tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers, organized in a great crescent formation intended to be nearly impossible to break, sailed north with the goal of linking up with a separate Spanish army waiting in the Netherlands, and together invading and conquering England. For Elizabeth, now 54 years old, The threat was existential in the most literal sense. A successful Spanish invasion would almost certainly have meant the end of her reign, the restoration of Catholicism by force, and quite possibly her own death or imprisonment. England's navy, though it included some genuinely skilled commanders and a number of faster, more maneuverable ships than the lumbering Spanish galleons, was considerably smaller than the force bearing down on it, and the country's coastal defences, in the event of an actual landing, were, by most honest assessments at the time, dangerously inadequate against a professional invading army of Spain's size and reputation. What followed, over the course of a tense and chaotic week in late July and early August, has become one of the most celebrated episodes in English history, and much of that celebration is earned. English ships, under commanders including Charles Howard, Francis Drake, and John Hawkins, harried the Spanish fleet as it moved up the Channel, using fire ships to break the tight defensive formation the Armada had maintained since leaving Spain, and engaging the scattered Spanish vessels in a series of running battles off the coast near Gravelines. The damage inflicted by English gunnery was significant, though perhaps less immediately decisive than popular memory sometimes suggests. What proved even more devastating to the Spanish fleet was the weather that followed. Scattered and unable to link up with the invasion force still waiting in the Netherlands, the Armada was forced to abandon its mission and attempt the long, dangerous journey home around the north of Scotland and along the west coast of Ireland, where a series of brutal Atlantic storms wrecked dozens of ships and killed thousands of sailors and soldiers who had set out from Spain only months before in genuine expectation of victory. The truth about what determined the outcome is more complicated than legend has sometimes allowed, since popular memory has simplified a contingent, chaotic sequence of events into a single, clean English triumph. English seamanship and naval tactics played a real and important role in disrupting the Armada's formation and preventing it from ever completing its intended mission of linking with the invasion force in the Netherlands. But the storms that scattered and destroyed so much of the retreating fleet were, in the most literal sense, beyond anyone's control, and English commanders and later English propaganda were quick to attribute the victory to divine providence. A medal struck to commemorate the event, carrying an inscription crediting God with sending the wind that scattered the Spanish ships. Whatever the precise balance between English skill, Spanish misfortune, and simple weather, the practical result was unmistakable. The invasion never happened. England remained Protestant, independent, and for the moment at least, unconquered. Before the full scale of the Spanish disaster became clear, while English forces were still gathering to meet an invasion that many genuinely believed was imminent, Elizabeth undertook one of the most famous public acts of her entire reign. In early August of 1588, she travelled to Tilbury, on the Thames estuary in Essex, where English land forces had assembled to defend against the anticipated Spanish landing, and addressed the assembled troops in person. She appeared before them, according to contemporary accounts, wearing a white gown with a silver breastplate over it, riding among the soldiers on a grey horse, a deliberately martial image for a monarch whose sex had, for her entire reign, been treated by so many as a fundamental disqualification from the business of war and command. Her speech to the troops that day, portions of which survive in later transcriptions, whose exact wording cannot be verified with complete certainty, but whose substance is well attested, addressed this doubt directly and unforgettably. She told the assembled soldiers that she knew she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but that she had the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, adding that she thought it foul scorn that any prince of Europe should dare invade the borders of her realm. It is difficult, even at a distance of more than 4 centuries, not to feel the deliberate power of that image and that language. Here was a queen who had spent her entire life being told, in one way or another, that her sex made her fundamentally unsuited to the exercise of real authority, standing in armor before an army awaiting the largest invasion fleet Europe had ever assembled, declaring in the most direct terms possible that whatever physical weakness her body might represent, her authority to command was not in question. Whether every word attributed to her that day was spoken precisely as later recorded, the speech at Tilbury has rightly endured as one of the defining moments of her reign, a moment in which the central tension of her entire life, the gap between what her sex was assumed to permit and what she was actually capable of commanding, found its most vivid and public expression. The defeat of the Armada transformed Elizabeth's standing, both at home and abroad, in ways that went well beyond the immediate military relief of an invasion successfully repelled. It became, almost immediately, a defining symbol of her reign, proof to a nation that had spent 30 years quietly uncertain whether a queen could truly protect her kingdom, that Elizabeth's rule carried a kind of divine favor and practical competence that silenced, at least for a time, many of the doubts that had shadowed her from the very beginning. Bonfires were lit across England in celebration. Commemorative medals were struck. The image of Elizabeth as a uniquely blessed, uniquely capable Protestant monarch, chosen by Providence to protect her kingdom against the greatest Catholic power in Europe, became one of the central pillars of the mythology that would surround her for the remainder of her life, and for centuries afterward. The war with Spain did not end with the Armada's defeat, however much popular memory has sometimes treated 1588 as a decisive conclusion. Fighting continued, in various forms, for the rest of Elizabeth's reign, through naval expeditions, continued English support for Protestant forces in the Netherlands, and repeated, though ultimately unsuccessful, Spanish attempts to mount further invasions in 1596 and again in 1597, both of which were scattered by storms before they could pose a serious threat. The war drained resources on both sides for years, without ever producing the kind of single decisive victory that either side had once hoped for, settling instead into a long, expensive stalemate that would only formally end after Elizabeth's own death, when her successor negotiated peace with Spain in 1604. But the immediate crisis of 1588 had passed, and Elizabeth, now solidly in her 50s, entered the final, and in some ways, most complicated phase of her long reign, a period marked by the gradual passing of the trusted advisors and companions who had surrounded her since the earliest days of her rule, and by a court increasingly anxious about a question that Elizabeth herself had spent decades deflecting. What would happen to England when she was gone? Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, the man whose companionship had defined Elizabeth's emotional life since childhood, died in September of 1588, only weeks after the Armada's defeat, of what appears to have been a sudden illness contracted while travelling. Elizabeth's grief, by contemporary accounts, was profound and unusually visible for a queen who had spent her entire life carefully guarding her private emotions from public display. She is said to have shut herself away for a period following the news, A letter from Dudley, written shortly before his death, was later found among her most private possessions after her own death, kept apparently for the remaining 15 years of her life, with a brief notation in her own hand marking it as his last letter. A queen who had built an entire public identity around romantic self-sufficiency, privately preserving a single letter from the one man whose company had meant something distinct from all the careful political calculation around her. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, her most trusted advisor since the very first day of her reign, continued serving her into old age, his own health declining steadily through the 1590s until his death in August of 1598, after 40 years of nearly continuous service. Francis Walsingham, the architect of the intelligence network that had uncovered plot after plot against her life, had died some years earlier, in 1590, worn down by ill health and by financial difficulties. That, despite his years of service, the Queen had never fully addressed, a small but telling reminder that Elizabeth's famous frugality did not always extend generously toward even her most loyal servants. By the final decade of her reign, Elizabeth was, in a very real sense, outliving the world that had made her. The counselors and companions who had helped her survive the uncertain early years of her rule, who had known her before she became the elaborately mythologized Virgin Queen of court portraiture, were dying around her, one by one, and being replaced by a younger generation of courtiers and advisors who had known her only as an aging monarch, already wrapped in decades of accumulated legend. It was into this changing court that one particular figure emerged with a force and intensity that would, in the final years of Elizabeth's reign, come to threaten everything her long career of careful, patient rule had been built to protect. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was young, magnetic, and in many respects, everything the aging Elizabethan court seemed hungry for. He was the stepson of Robert Dudley, connected by that family tie to the man who had once meant so much to Elizabeth, and he arrived at court in the mid-1580s as a strikingly handsome young nobleman with real charm and evident ambition. Elizabeth, by this point in her 50s, appears to have been genuinely drawn to his company in a manner that many at court and many historians since have found difficult to categorize with full confidence. It was not, by most reasonable assessment, a romantic relationship in any literal sense, given the considerable difference in their ages and Elizabeth's own lifelong caution around exactly this kind of entanglement. But it carried, by contemporary account, an unmistakable emotional intensity, something between the affection of a mother for a favored, difficult son and the fondness of an aging monarch for a young man who reminded her, whether she fully admitted it or not, of the vigor and possibility of years she could not get back. Essex was showered with favor. He was given military commands, court positions, and a degree of personal access to the Queen that provoked real jealousy among more established courtiers. But he was also, by nearly every account that survives, temperamentally unsuited to the patient, careful diplomacy that Elizabeth had spent her entire reign practicing. He was impulsive, prone to public displays of wounded pride, and increasingly convinced of his own indispensability. On more than one occasion, he clashed openly with Elizabeth in ways that no other courtier of her long reign would have dared attempt. In one notorious incident, during an argument over the appointment of a governor for Ireland, Essex reportedly turned his back on the Queen in a gesture of open contempt. When Elizabeth, provoked beyond patience, struck him, He is said to have placed his hand on his sword before being restrained, an act that, against any other monarch in Europe, would very likely have ended his life on the spot. It did not end his life, at least not yet, a fact that says a great deal about just how much latitude Elizabeth was willing to extend to this particular young man. Latitude she extended to virtually no one else across her entire reign. But it could not last indefinitely, and the final crisis of Essex's career arrived through Ireland, a persistent and costly problem for the English crown throughout Elizabeth's reign, where a prolonged rebellion led by the Irish nobleman Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, had drained English resources and patience for years. In 1599, Elizabeth appointed Essex to lead a major military expedition intended, at long last, to crush the rebellion decisively. It was the largest force she had ever committed to an overseas campaign during her reign, and expectations, both from the Queen and from the wider public, were correspondingly high. Essex's conduct of the campaign proved a serious disappointment. Rather than pursuing Tyrone directly, he spent months on smaller, less consequential engagements, eventually meeting with Tyrone privately and agreeing to a truce on terms that Elizabeth found humiliatingly favourable to the rebels, arrived at without her authorization and communicated to her only after the fact. Furious at what she regarded as a costly and dishonourable failure, compounded by Essex's decision to abandon his command and return to England without royal permission, in direct violation of explicit instructions to remain in Ireland, Elizabeth had him placed under house arrest upon his sudden and unannounced arrival at court, reportedly having burst into her private chambers before she had finished dressing for the day, a breach of protocol and propriety that shocked those who witnessed it. Essex was stripped of several of his official positions and, crucially, of the lucrative monopoly on sweet wine imports that had provided much of his income, a financial blow that left him deeply in debt and increasingly desperate. By early 1601, Essex, humiliated, financially ruined, and convinced that rivals at court, chiefly Robert Cecil, the son of Elizabeth's late chief minister, William Cecil, were working to destroy him entirely, gathered a group of supporters and attempted what can only be described as an ill-conceived and poorly executed uprising. On the 8th of February, 1601, he marched into London with several hundred armed followers, apparently hoping to rally the city's population to his cause and force his way into Elizabeth's presence to remove what he considered corrupting influences from around her. The uprising collapsed almost immediately. London's citizens did not rise to join him. Essex was quickly surrounded, arrested, and charged with treason. Elizabeth, now 67 years old, faced the excruciating task of deciding the fate of a man who had occupied an emotional place in her later life, unlike almost any other. There is no reliable record of exactly what she felt as the trial proceeded, and it would be a mistake to invent an interior emotional narrative the historical record cannot support. But the decision, when it came, was unambiguous. Essex was tried, convicted, and executed on the 25th of February, 1601, at the Tower of London, the same fortress that had once held Elizabeth herself as a young and frightened prisoner, and where her own mother had been executed 65 years earlier. It is one of the more striking symmetries of Elizabeth's long life, whether or not she herself consciously registered it in those terms. The Tower had marked one of the most formative traumas of her childhood, the place where her mother died, and where she herself had once been imprisoned under suspicion of treason. Now, at the very end of her reign, It became the place where she was forced to authorize the execution of a young man whose company had brought her, by most accounts, real personal comfort during the isolating final years of her life. The pattern that had shaped her earliest years, the terrible collision between personal affection and political necessity, had, in its way, followed her all the way to the end. Essex's rebellion, though it never posed a genuine military threat to Elizabeth's throne, left a mark on her final years that went beyond its immediate political consequences. Contemporary observers at court described a queen who, in the months and years that followed, seemed increasingly withdrawn, increasingly given to long silences, and increasingly preoccupied with a past that so many of the people who had shared it with her, Dudley, Cecil, Walsingham, and now Essex, were no longer alive to remember alongside her. Elizabeth's final years brought a slow but unmistakable decline. She had always been remarkably active for a monarch of her age, riding, hunting, and dancing well into her 60s, activities that visiting ambassadors noted with genuine surprise given her advancing years. But by 1602, those close to her observed a marked change. She grew increasingly melancholic, spoke often of those she had outlived, and according to several accounts from courtiers who attended her in these final months, seemed to withdraw from the elaborate performance of eternal youth that had defined her public image for so many decades. There is a particular, quietly haunting detail recorded by one of her attendants during this final period. Elizabeth is reported to have refused, for long stretches, to go to bed at night, insisting instead on remaining seated on cushions on the floor of her chamber, unwilling or unable to lie down, in a state that those around her found deeply troubling. She reportedly refused for a time to see a physician and grew distressed at any suggestion that she should retire to rest. The precise medical explanation for this final decline remains uncertain, though historians have suggested a combination of physical illness, possibly pneumonia, or a related respiratory condition common among the elderly in this period, and a broader psychological exhaustion. A queen who had spent 70 years of life almost entirely defined by vigilance, finally arriving at a point where the vigilance itself had become unbearable. She died on the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond Palace, in the early hours of the morning, having reportedly slipped, in her final hours, into a peaceful sleep from which she did not wake. She was 69 years old and had reigned for 44 years, longer than any English monarch since the medieval period, and longer, at the time, than any woman had ever reigned over any European kingdom in recorded memory. She left no direct heir, having never married, and the question that had haunted her entire reign, who would follow her, was resolved not through any child of her own body, but through careful, largely secret diplomatic arrangement conducted in her final years by Robert Cecil, who had quietly corresponded with James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the cousin whose execution Elizabeth had authorized 16 years earlier, to ensure a smooth transition of power once Elizabeth's death finally came. James was proclaimed King of England within hours of Elizabeth's death, becoming James I of England while remaining James VI of Scotland, uniting the two crowns that had spent so many turbulent decades locked in uneasy, often dangerous rivalry. It is a striking final irony of Elizabeth's story that the throne she had guarded so fiercely, so carefully, for over 4 decades, passed in the end to the direct descendant of the cousin whose death warrant she had signed with such visible anguish, the son of the very woman whose execution had represented one of the most agonizing decisions of her entire reign. Whatever comfort or vindication that particular resolution might have offered, if any, Elizabeth did not live to see how James's own reign would unfold, nor how history would eventually come to judge the balance between her caution and her cousin's ambition. What are we left with at the end of a life that began with a birth announcement hastily corrected by hand, and ended with a queen curled on cushions on her own bedroom floor, unwilling to lie down and rest? Elizabeth's reign is remembered, and rightly so, as a period of extraordinary cultural flowering. The London theatre scene reached heights during her rule that would shape the English language and English literature for centuries afterward, with William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and a generation of playwrights producing work under the patronage and protection of a court culture that Elizabeth herself, whatever the exact extent of her personal involvement, helped to sustain. English exploration and maritime ambition expanded significantly during her reign, laying groundwork for better and for considerably worse for the colonial ventures that would define England's and later Britain's relationship with the wider world for centuries to come. Those ventures brought immense wealth to some and immense suffering through conquest, displacement, and the early involvement of English traders in the transatlantic slave trade to many others. It would be a distortion of the historical record to remember Elizabeth's age purely as a golden era of poetry and naval triumph, without acknowledging the darker undercurrents of expansion and exploitation that ran alongside it. Undercurrents that Elizabeth's own government, in its pursuit of wealth and strategic advantage, was not innocent of encouraging. Domestically, England under Elizabeth achieved a degree of religious and political stability that had seemed almost impossible to imagine at the moment of her accession, when the kingdom had been shattered by 3 consecutive changes of official religion within a single generation. The Elizabethan settlement, imperfect and at times harshly enforced against both Catholic reticents and radical Protestant dissenters, nonetheless established a framework of relative religious moderation that spared England the scale of sustained religious warfare that devastated so much of continental Europe during the same decades. Her reign also avoided the kind of catastrophic, sustained continental war that drained France and Spain of resources and lives across this same period, a restraint born not of pacifism, but of the same careful, patient caution that had defined her temperament since childhood, a caution her more aggressive advisors often found maddening, and which historians have, on balance, generally judged to have served her kingdom well. And yet, Elizabeth's own life, examined closely, resists the simple, celebratory version of the Virgin Queen mythology that her own court worked so hard to construct, and that later centuries have sometimes been content to inherit uncritically. She was, first and unmistakably, a survivor. A woman who spent the first 25 years of her life navigating threats to her safety, her legitimacy, and her very survival, with a composure that few people of any era could have sustained. That survival instinct, forged in a childhood defined by her mother's execution, her own father's ambivalence, a predatory stepfather, a formal treason investigation as a teenager, and imprisonment in the very fortress where her mother had died, shaped every major decision of her adult reign, from her famous refusal to commit to marriage, to her long, agonized reluctance to execute her cousin, to her careful, patient cultivation of a public image designed to project a strength that her own most private circumstances had never guaranteed her. The central contradiction of Elizabeth's life, in the end, may be this: a woman who built one of history's most enduring images of confident, singular, self-sufficient female authority, while privately carrying, for her entire life, the accumulated caution of a childhood, spent learning that affection, ambition, and even simple survival could be taken away at any moment by decisions entirely beyond her control. The Virgin Queen, who declared she was married only to her kingdom, kept, until her own death, a single letter from the one man whose company had meant something different from all the rest, a small, private contradiction tucked away behind decades of carefully managed public performance. She came to the throne as a young woman that almost no one, inside or outside England, fully expected to succeed. She left it 44 years later, having reshaped what her kingdom believed a monarch, and specifically what a female monarch could accomplish. The girl who had once been reduced by a single stroke of the pen, from princess to Lady Elizabeth, had spent an entire lifetime and an entire reign proving, patiently and repeatedly, exactly how much that judgment had underestimated her. Sleep well.